With me now is the Shadow Foreign Minister, Penny Wong. Thanks for your time this afternoon.
Good to be with you, David.
So there's a bit to talk about. I want to get to your foreign policy speech yesterday on China as well, but just on this situation in northern Syria, it has unravelled quickly over the last week. The UN now says there are 160,000 displaced people there. Aid organisations are struggling to get in, and there is a real concern about the resurgence of Islamic State. What should Australia be doing?
When this news of this withdrawal and the imminent invasion first broke, I made some public comments. I said that that an invasion and military intervention by Turkey would compromise and erode regional stability and global stability. I said it would exacerbate a humanitarian crisis and it would compromise the fight against Daesh or ISIS. And I think those aren't just my views, they're the views that quite a number of, not only commentators, but General Votel, the former US Central Command General, said the same thing, as has Lindsey Graham. Now, regrettably, I think we are seeing that playing out. And I think the government is right to press the Turkish government to cease the military intervention. I've also made the point, as have a number of Republicans and former military personnel, that this decision has been enabled by the decision of the Trump administration to withdraw. It is true that the intervention, the military attack, is Turkey's decision.
But you think Donald Trump wears part of it?
Oh, well, the words I have used, and I will use them carefully, is that it is a decision that has obviously been enabled by the decision to withdraw.
Now we've got Bashar al-Assad's forces,
Yes.
the Syrian forces, moving north into some of these towns to try and take control, and that sets up the prospect of a bigger confrontation between their forces and Turkey. Is this a good thing or not?
Escalation of violence, with all that means for civilians, for women and children, as well as military personnel, is a bad thing, isn't it? But it is not entirely unforeseeable that that you would see a realignment given these new circumstances, as I and many others said a number of days ago.
What more can Australia do
escalate
beyond saying that Turkey should back off? Because they're clearly not going to.
Well, it's obviously not a region where any one country calls the shots, least of all Australia. But we should be part of the multilateral, the world community, pushing for a ceasefire. I note that the US administration has today called for a ceasefire, today our time, and we should back that in very strongly.
What about some sort of peacekeeping force?
Well, I mean, let's take one step at a time. I think the first thing is to try and see if the international community can work with the various nation states and forces here to try and at least have a ceasefire and to see if there is a pathway towards a settlement.
But if that doesn't work,
I don't have a. Unfortunately, I can't see the future here. At the moment, I think it does look very grim, and we should do all we can.
We have a more direct interest, obviously, in the Australian citizens who are there. There's a small number of men, the foreign fighters, who have been imprisoned there by the Kurds, and then a large number of women and children, 60 or so. What's your view of what Australia should do about them?
Well, Christina Keneally, I think, went to this directly today on Insiders earlier this week, and she made, I think, two very good points. One is that the government has, as a consequence of bipartisan legislation passed through the Parliament, a very wide range of powers, a toolkit, I think she described that as to how you might deal with the threat of returning people who are a risk who return. She also made the point is that this is a complex and difficult situation, and it really is a matter the government needs to consider about how best to approach the very...
But do you agree with Christina Keneally that Australia should consider bringing them all back?
I think Australia can't simply turn a blind eye. I think there are real issues in terms of the security of any personnel dealing with this, and you would never want people putting themselves in harm's way. I think we all would agree that children are not responsible for the sins of their parents, and I think it is a sensible thing for Christina to articulate what she has, which is, if possible, the government should consider the options it has.
That includes, though, the men who have been in prison, the actual foreign fighters. These are dangerous terrorists. To be clear, you are agreeing the government should at least consider bringing them back.
Well, I think we should first look at those who are the victims. There is an issue which the world has to deal with now as a consequence of the decision of the US to withdraw and what has now occurred in terms of in northern Syria and in terms of the security situation there. There were thousands of Daesh or ISIS fighters and supporters who were kept securely by Kurdish forces, and that security has been compromised. And, so the world, it's not just an Australian issue, and you're pressing a certain point.
Well, it's an important point.
But I'd encourage you, let's not walk into a Peter Dutton-style thing where you ask me a series of questions and the government tries to blow up what is a really difficult situation by alleging that we want to bring terrorists back. So please don't.
No, I'm not. I'm just wanting to be clear whether you agree. We should at least consider.
We have to consider what we do with ISIS fighters who are Australians. Yes, how do we ensure the world and Australians are most safe?
What would be the ideal?
Well, I wouldn't profess to know what the ideal is. The ideal would be...
But this is the very conundrum, isn't it?
Well, the ideal, it would be that, people didn't fight with ISIS, but we don't live in that world. The ideal would be that we lessen the ungoverned space around the world. That is a critical aspect of making people safer.
When it comes to women and kids, though, I mean, you're right, the kids can't be blamed for the situation they're in. The Prime Minister and Peter Dutton keep saying that's very dangerous, and you agree. How practically could you get them out?
Well, I think that is a matter for the government, and we wouldn't want to make partisan points around that. I think Christina was quite correct when she said that we don't want people put in harm's way. That they're judgments ministers have to make about these situations, and I.
Do you think it's possible, though? Obviously.
Oh no, I don't know. I'm not the minister, and I'm not being briefed about these issues.
You're not being briefed?
Well, not about... Well, I wouldn't discuss what I'm being briefed on and all, but I'm saying those are very difficult decisions that ministers would have to make, and I assume that ministers are doing so with the best intelligence and security advice.
Let's turn to your speech yesterday on China. You said, quote, "China's not a democracy, nor does the Chinese Communist Party share our commitment to the rule of law." You spoke to the differences in our values, in fact. I mean, frankly, it did sound a little bit like what Peter Dutton was saying the other day.
There was, I think, a very clear point about how I did that. I didn't just go out and do a press conference where I decided to create a domestic political debate. I mean, it was a considered speech. It was a speech that talked through the differences, the fact that between, China and Australia, but also the areas of convergence. It talked about the fact that this is a challenging time in the global environment, a challenging time in the bilateral relationship, given China's increased assertiveness across a whole range of domains, and talked about how we ought to deal with that. Talked about we need to continue to engage, and we also need to be really clear about the terms of that engagement. I think I picked up a phrase about bounded engagement.
Well, I want to get to that, because you did talk about the need for Australia to define the boundaries in our engagement with China. Now, what does that mean? What would this sort of boundary drawing look like?
And can I just make a point which I didn't get to in my previous answer? I should have got there straight away. I mean, my concern about Mr Dutton's intervention is really my concern about much of what the government is doing on foreign policy, but China more specifically. Is there a plan? Well, was the plan just for him to have a domestically focused press conference, or was there actually a plan for the Home Affairs Minister to go and be that blunt? And frankly, his language was quite rhetorically colourful. And my point in the speech also, it's not just about content. What matters also is how you do this. You then had the Prime Minister backing away from Mr Dutton's speech. It doesn't seem to me that that's a thought-out
Well, OK, perhaps. I mean, he was asked questions about it. He gave an answer which, on substance at least, doesn't appear to be too far from what you're saying about Chinese Communist Party values.
I have said a number of times, we are a democracy, China is not. That is inevitably going to create...
So to your point about the need for some boundaries, what does that look like?
Oh, that is something we ought to work through together, and that is partly why I have expressed to Senator Payne a desire for the Parliament to get a better set of briefings. She can decide how and in what how that might operate, but a better engagement, a more informed engagement, more briefing about how to manage the China relationship.
I mean, should we draw, for example, red lines that says,
of course there are things where we should say we can't on these issues, we want these matters excluded from engagement, but on these matters we can engage closely. I mean, critical infrastructure, for example, you know, we have foreign investment, we need foreign investment, but we've made decisions about where you can and can't. I used an example from a recent research piece which talked about how you might draw more specific boundaries around research and which research we would want to engage very closely on and which research we might have actually...
Well, just on that, is there some research that is going on in collaboration with China that shouldn't be?
No, I wasn't actually referencing that. I saw this this academic who had, and this is an issue that's been discussed at various times in the strategic community. There's been much commentary about it, and it seemed to me, rather than just talking about it, what was useful about that research was that it was actually proposing a series of a set of policies that universities might actually adopt.
You're right to say there are some mixed signals coming from the government on China. Do you concede there are also some mixed signals coming from Labor on China? And perhaps this is inevitable as this assertiveness continues to grow from Xi Jinping.
It is a different phase. I think that was the title of my speech. Yeah. It's a different phase in the relationship because China is in a different place. It is much more assertive. It's a different place economically and strategically. So in terms of how it's projected...
You can't just have a go at the government for lacking clarity on this.
We're not the government. And I think if you look...
So it's OK for you to be inconsistent?
Well, I don't think I am inconsistent.
Not you, but the party, because you've got Kim Carr saying, Kimberley Kitching saying...
With all due respect, backbenchers in our party, you know, whether they're on the way up or on the twilight of their career, that they're entitled to...
Which one's Kim Carr?
Yeah, well, I think he was... was I still at university when Kim got
OK.
But, you know, he's got his views. I mean, I haven't read the articles concerned.
But you don't agree with the headline points he's making?
Of course not. I mean, my speech is clear about that, but I mean, he's entitled to make them. I think it's a very different thing when you've got the Prime Minister disagreeing with his ministers. I mean, I'll give you two examples. Mr Morrison went to the Lowy Institute, talked about negative globalism and talked about international organisations controlling what we do. Just a month before, Marise Payne gives a speech talking about how wonderful and important multilateralism is to Australia. Now, she's right, and she's actually reflecting a foreign policy tradition which has been pretty consistent. But Mr Morrison goes out and says something really completely different. On the World Trade Organisation, before he gives the speech in the US, Senator Birmingham gives a measured speech about China's place in the WTO and how we need to work together to work out how it can take on further responsibilities. And then we get Mr Morrison after a Trump rally. Giving a speech where he declares...
Where he said that China's developed.
A developed country. And I just think,
what do you think on that point, though?
What is the strategy?
Is he right on that point?
The Minister's saying one thing and the Prime Minister's saying something else. What is the strategy?
Just on that point, though, is China a developed...
You tell me what the strategy is. What do you reckon?
I'm not here to answer for the government.
No, but you're an intelligent man. Can you see the strategy?
I'm just asking the questions. Do you think China is a developed economy?
We've had this discussion before, and I thought about that after we had that discussion. I thought, actually, I don't think it's the right question. The right question is the one that actually Simon Birmingham posed and I went to yesterday in the speech, which is, how do you make the WTO fit for purpose? How do you make sure, through that multilateral organisation, that China takes on responsibilities that is commensurate with its size and its economic position? Now,
it's somewhere on that trajectory.
Yeah, sure. But my point is, if you want China to do that, do you reckon calling for it in the US, after you've gone to a Trump rally, is going to get anything other than a dismissive response, not only from China but from other countries? Oh, you're just running the US line, and that is precisely what happened.
A final one, Labor's agreed today.
Apart from anything, it also distracted everybody from noticing whether or not Mr Morrison got anything from Mr Trump on the trade war. But anyway.
Well, we'll look at that for another day. The Labor caucus today agreed to move a motion declaring Australia is facing, or the world is facing, a climate emergency. What's that going to do, a motion along those lines?
Oh, yeah, obviously you need a policy to back up a response to this position, and well, certainly the government hasn't got one.
The motion doesn't deliver one.
Well, but I think it's important for us to, as the UK Parliament did, and I heard Senator Canavan in the chamber railing on about this, and I thought, so is he really saying that the people at Westminster are somehow turned into radical socialists or something? When the reality is we are facing really dire circumstances, and we need governments and political leaders to show...
Is this also about the Labor caucus pushing back a bit at Joel Fitzgibbon?
Oh no, I think people do worry about, and as does Joel, worry about what do we do as a party of government who's in opposition to try and change where Australia is at.
Well, his worry is you've gone too far, that you should back the government's target.
I think Joel has made very clear that he recognises the importance of climate change and the reality of the science.
But he wants to back the government's target, do you?
No, I mean, I agree with Mark Butler. I think you've got to be consistent in these issues, and I think you should have targets consistent with your Paris Agreement, which the government does not.
Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong, we will have to leave it there, but thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Great to see you.
I do appreciate it.